Good morning, everybody. It's my responsibility, in this opening session, to present the changing context in which the environmental debate, as it relates to buildings, has played out over the last 40 years, and maybe anticipate what it might be in the future for 40 years. So this is the time period from 1970 out to 2050 is what I'm going to try and present a picture. One's faced with a number of difficulties here, of course, whereas the past and the present are somewhat known to us, the future is always going to be speculative. We may be able to discuss the nature of preferable, plausible, and possible and probable futures, and maybe even present those in terms of a pessimistic futures or very positive futures, but nonetheless, any future will likely be speculative. So the way I want to conclude this session is to end up not by actually presenting a future, but try and anticipate what is likely to become more important to us in the building community and what is likely to become less important as we move forward. Of course, the story can't begin in 1970. We have to go back maybe a long way to fully understand the context which we find ourselves and actually maybe what the future may unfold. Certainly Western societies remain largely entrapped in a Cartesian, Newtonian, mechanistic worldview that had its roots back in the mid-17th century. This is a worldview that implicitly places human enterprise dominant over and essentially independent of natural systems. What we saw, of course, in the late 19th century was the emergence of biology and ecology, and this essentially challenged the primacy of reductive thinking, which had been evident for the previous 2 centuries. We have indigenous cultures that have always understood, in many ways, a more holistic view of the relationship between people and natural systems. And I think now we begin to understand ourselves that we are indeed integral to and interdependent on natural systems. So the issue is, in a larger way, is not what the future buildings is going to be, but what will be the prevailing dominant worldview in the future. Which one of those plays out will profoundly affect just how we progress in the kind of decisions we make relative to buildings. If you start to unpack this a little bit closer, we start to look at what reductive thinking has given us. The behavior of the whole can be analyzed in terms of the properties of its parts. This is a characteristic of most building environmental assessment methods. We understand individual performance attributes and somehow imagine that the sum of those gives us an understanding of what the performance of a building might be. By contrast, systems thinking, where I think we have to move towards, posits the idea that properties can only be understood within the context of the larger whole. And that's going to be a position I'm going to start to unfold as we move forward in this presentation. We have seen a shift clearly from the machine metaphor to now a large acceptance of the network metaphor, where it's not the individual pieces that become important, but the links and synergies between them that start to assume a greater importance in a future evolving environmental discourse. We can look at components. Again, we have a great deal of knowledge and understanding of components, but clearly what we really understand, in this instance, an example, the bicycle, understand how the bicycle represents behaviorally and culturally a fundamentally different position in terms of within the wider societal context. Again, it's on this right-hand side that I'm interested in pursuing where the seeds of a future discussion might unfold. The more significant thing, I think, of this last 2 centuries of reductive thinking, it's left us with, individually and collectively, with ingrained biases that favor simplicity, certainty, and immediacy. We have Stuart Brand's book that Richard referred to just a minute ago, The Clock of the Long Now, where he opens up the book with a statement essentially that society is on a pathological path of the short attention span. We can't think past next weekend when environmentalism requires us to take the long view. So this idea in terms of how our worldview constrains us and how we have to change that to imagine how we can begin to engage in the larger future becomes extremely important within this discussion. 1972, very close to 40 years back, was a remarkable set of publications which came out and represented, if you will, the very tenure of the times. It was very much about understanding the necessity to live within the biophysical limits of a planet, a single planet. And what we were seeing in terms of what was understood at that time, that we indeed were moving and surpassing those limits, and we were on the threshold of environmental collapse. That was very much the times back in the early 70s. Also, we started to see the emergence, if you will, of small, appropriate technologies with the idea that they indeed empower people. I want to refer back to this because I believe we're on the threshold now of another movement which is about empowering people to take more control of their lives. We maybe want to understand what the actual technological base that gives it that opportunity. Yes, I thought I'd throw in a few photographs from the family album. If you look closer, you can probably pick me out. I will give you a few clues. But yes, this was all about the emergence and the technologies of a counterculture. Again, I believe that we're on the threshold of a new counterculture, but the technological base of that counterculture will be qualitatively different from what we saw in the early 1970s. These are two publications back to back, if you will, one from 1971 and the other from 1992. They reflect an enormous change that occurred in a 20-year time frame. Back in 1971, the issue of progressive architecture, a North American architectural magazine, the theme of that issue was life support systems for a dying planet. Nothing captures the tenor of the times more than that statement. Of course, then we had the Rio Conference on the Environment and Development, and that was one where the emphasis was that we need to come together and show greater levels of stewardship as we move forward in terms of our understanding and engagement with healing the planet. So if you now start to look at what we've actually moved through in terms of some of the dominant ideas, they are really quite remarkable. Back in the 70s, when you had issues of limits to growth and survivalism, if we believe indeed that the world was coming apart, then the notions of autonomy and bioregionalism started to become front and center, certainly within that counterculture. We have the 1980s and the energy crisis raising the terms conservation and efficiency. Then we moved into this period in the 90s of responsibility and stewardship, and the term green started to appear. With that, we find the emergence of building performance assessment tools, integrated design, life cycle analysis, all in many ways speaking of some sense of taking on responsibility. Then we have events like 9/11, where the notion of security starts to become important. And terms like future-proofing, passive survivability, self-reliance, again, become very dominant terms in the discussion about green building and green building practice. Sustainability, of course, since 1987, has been an overarching term that we use. Today, the discussion somewhat is actually quite narrow. It's about mitigation and increasingly maybe thinking about the importance of adapting to a changing future. But we have performance goals like net zero energy and carbon neutrality for buildings being a dominant part of our performance aspirations. I believe that we're moving into a different kind of period where the notion of localization and regenerative design will start to become important, and notions of decentralization, the importance of place, and indeed local networks and systems will start to dominate our discussion in the next 10 to 20 or 30 years. If we start to look at the scale of intervention, over the past 40 years, we've seen the emergence of the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Within a very narrow window, they've released essentially four assessment reports. We expect that the fifth one, when it comes out, will paint an even more dire picture of the situation of anthropogenic carbon emissions and the consequence of its exacerbation more further of climate change. We've also seen United Nations climate change framework, the committed conferences, the parties. You've seen this, the most important one that we use as the benchmark still being the Kyoto conference, but every year there's been a major and important gathering of international leaders to try and hammer out some international agreement on the curbing of greenhouse gas emissions. This report was extremely important for me. It came out earlier this year, and the fundamental conclusion from this report was that a comprehensive international climate change agreement will probably be possible only when a critical mass of countries is committed because of self-interest rather than perceived altruism to take insufficient action. Nobody will act for the common good. We only act, it seems, when it's in our self-interest. If this applies to our world, at what level should indeed this self-interest play out? At the level of the building, the level of the neighborhood, the level of the city, the level of the country? That becomes an important discussion for us. Again, despite the importance of the work, this has been a kind of a critical statement here, if you will, be made, that we may have to wait a long time before we indeed see any collective agreement internationally on the curbing of greenhouse gas emissions. And clearly, if that's the problem for us, because if we're not prepared to change our ways, then for me, you see these absurd recommendations or ideas being put on the table. Geoengineering, the idea of actually sort of iron seeding our oceans, of cloud seeding our skies, for putting thousands of mirrors into outer space to reflect back the sun. This, indeed, is not beautiful technology. This is big and ugly approaches and extremely dangerous, but because there seems to be no significant shift on our part to change our ways, then the notion of large-scale technology seems to be maybe emerging in the background, and hopefully it stays in the distant background as a possibility. Of course, over this period as well, this past 40 years, we've seen the growth and influence of multinational corporations, the all-encompassing systems of trade and finance, mass tourism, all these things collectively interlocking the world into a single global culture. The general agreement on tariffs and trade, which morphed into the World Trade Organization, in many ways being the embodiment, indeed, of that globalized change, certainly when it comes to industry and finance. Of course, globalization has many critics, but yet it remains pervasive and its momentum still amazingly overwhelming. It's quite remarkable to me that Peter Buchanan, back in 1984, made this very prophetic statement that somehow the notion of a truly universal civilization, and that somehow we may be in the midst of a very traumatic period prior to the birth of a viable global civilization in which networks of communication and trade will no longer be homogenizing and destructive agents, but will have sufficient capacity to allow regional peculiarities to survive and be savored, i.e. the global culture will mature to such an extent that it will permit within that this condition, encourage that depth of experience that comes from being rooted in and caring for local issues. The relationship between the local and the global starting to become extremely important within any current and future discussion. I'm going to go back and look at another globalizing issue, communications technologies. Now, I'm sure many of you in the audience had, and maybe even still have, that 128K power machine, Macintosh, when it came out in 1983. Of course, that was interesting in of itself, but 1992 saw the real power emergence of the World Wide Web, and we've seen a whole range of new technologies, new communication technologies emerging. Now, clearly, small has become beautiful again. We hold it in our hand, and basically it gives us access to a whole range of new possibilities that we didn't have, clearly, in the 70s. Now, this is kind of intriguing. When you start to look at world trade in terms of resistance to the World Trade Organization, this is not basically people rioting in the streets. This is people queuing up outside the Apple stores for the latest and greatest piece of technology. So we've embraced one technology and essentially opposed another, but both have their distinct characteristics. Because if we look at information technologies, we are moving presumably towards a fully interconnected world, where numerous invisible, omnipresent, always-on communicating computers embedded in everyday artifacts and environments. This may be one scenario for the future. And indeed, what does that bring? It brings us this condition of placelessness, digital access from anywhere to anywhere. So in the same way that global trade has essentially spawned a context for localization, communication information technologies now are maybe placing greater need to stimulate ourselves in identifiable and meaningful physical places. Both those two dimensions of globalization are clearly creating a context for the importance of place as an essential component that needs to be restored, understood, and cared for as we move forward in environmental discourse. Over the past 40 years, we've seen the emergence of building environmental assessment methods. For me, one of the most significant, if not the most significant development in building environmental assessment methods has been the fact that all the major developers have introduced a version for communities or urban design. The scale has gone up from individual buildings to another scale. This, for me, is enormously telling and enormously important. We've seen the characteristic of many assessment tools, a declaration of performance requirements and the idea that we will add those together to get an overall measure of the performance of a building. I think we're starting to see those tools being complemented or replaced by others. Tools which talk of place, tools which look at the flows from nature, how we use it and how we return it back to nature, and how we start to look at the synergies and links between all the components that place a building within the context in which it sits. I would argue maybe these are going to emerge in the future. Just to wrap up, I thought I'd go and look at the American Institute of Architects, their conference theme in 1971. It's an intriguing read. 1971, The Hard Choices. Look at the questions they posed themselves in 1971. What should be the patterns of human settlement at the national, region, and local scale? I.e., there was clearly a discussion about differences playing out at different scales as being represented in their aspiration. Within these patterns of dispersion, how do we use all our human resources? This was back in the 70s, clearly in terms of how do we employ human resources in that context? What do we have to give up to create a livable environment? Seemingly a conflict between environmentalism and the quality of life. This was the 70s. Now, if you go and look at the American Institute of Architects 2011 conference, look at the title, Regional Design, Revolution, and Ecology Matters. Innovative approaches to planning, design, and construction, along with evolutionary or revolutionary approaches to practice, collaboration, and partnerships can create more resilient urban ecosystems where cities of all scales contribute to a region's sustainability and regeneration. Again, the American Institute of Architects is concerned with buildings. They frame it in terms of the scale of their concern as being cities. Very interesting indeed. So, to wrap up my presentation here, I set myself the task of trying to understand what may become more important in the future. And I think it's going to be this co-evolutionary and partner relationship between human and natural systems as being presented by those advocates of regenerative design. Place, the notion of place will become extremely important. Greater self-reliance at the local community level. Systems and synergies, the way in which we can see links and synergies across multiple scales and between various systems will assume considerable importance in our discussion. Stakeholders. Clearly, a numerous range of stakeholders are involved with delivery and maintenance of buildings, but what we will see, I believe, are new forms of cooperation, partnership, and information exchange between them. Now, what's likely to become less important, and this is dangerous turf to be on in front of this audience, I believe that the primacy of individual building as the focus of environmental performance will diminish. Building performance goals. performance goals, I believe, for individual buildings will be set within the larger, more comprehensive community goals. The notion of carbon neutral building disappears. The notion of carbon neutral community gets more significant, and we understand what the contribution of individual buildings are within that larger community scale goal. Building environmental assessment tools will be complemented initially, and I suspect replaced by those that identify links and synergies at different scales. So with that, I conclude my presentation for you. Thank you.